The United States has reached a tipping point. 2 in 3 Americans hold at least one negative view about tipping culture in America, according to a recent Bankrate survey. The sentiment seems to be growing in recent years as tipping is down approximately 10% in 2023 from just 2 years prior for restaurant servers, food delivery workers, hairstylists, taxis, and other service workers. Today, I want to talk about how we've reached this tipping point, and to do so, we're going to look at the economics on why tipping culture has expanded in the last couple of years. In my research for this video, I identified there were 3 main reasons why tipping has gotten out of control. The first one is the pandemic, and I know that isn't an economic reason, but it really helps lay kind of the foundation for the economics that we'll talk about in a moment. When the COVID pandemic happened, a lot of people were put in a hard spot. Many businesses and service workers were faced with a dramatic drop in demand as many people were ordered to stay home. And as a way to support those businesses and frontline workers they employ, many people started tipping more often. Tipping the food service worker that makes your burrito, tip the DoorDash guy that drops off your food. It was a way of saying thank you to those that were doing their job and potentially risking their health, while many people stayed at home to avoid exposure to the COVID-19 virus. Not only did we tip more often for services we may have not in the past, we also increased the amount that we were tipping to these essential workers. The worst of the pandemic has come and gone, but the expectations around those tipping behaviors still lingers. It's almost as if we've seen inflation around tipping because of the pandemic. Speaking of inflation, that leads us into the second reason for the expansion of tipping culture. In the post-pandemic world, the macroeconomic picture has really shifted, and for the sake of discussion on tipping, there are 2 important macroeconomic metrics to consider. The first is inflation. The global economy entered a state of higher inflation in the years after the start of the COVID pandemic. Inflation has been all over the news, and I have discussed it a fair amount on my channel in the past. Businesses, especially restaurants, are faced with a tough situation. They don't want to raise the prices on their menu too high. That could scare off customers, especially ones that are sensitive to inflation. In addition to rising food costs, these businesses are also faced with another economic problem: finding staff for their restaurants and bars. Now, there's no question that food prices have seen an uptick as a result of inflation. So this leads us to the question, can these restaurants afford to account for the increasing cost of labor as well? Generally, no, they can't, or they refuse to at least. So what do? They pass that cost of labor onto the customers in the form of tipping. To understand that, let's take a closer look at the labor market. The labor market in the US has been quite robust in the months and years that have passed since the shutdown days of the pandemic. US unemployment has remained quite low, around 3.5% for the last year or so. In fact, unemployment has remained so low that many business owners have infamously lamented that nobody wants to work anymore. When labor markets get tight, firms have to bid up the cost of labor to acquire the workers they need to run their businesses. When looking at the business model in the US for restaurants and bars, employers are allowed to offer a substandard minimum wage to these workers. The federal minimum wage for this category is a whopping $2.13 an hour for workers that are able to receive tip compensation. But that does vary from state to state, as they are allowed to set their own minimum wages, but just keep in mind they aren't making substantial wages off of hourly pay from their employer. This is largely accepted in the US because a large portion of those workers' income comes from the established tipping culture in the United States. So these restaurants have an incentive to nudge customers into paying more in tips. They promise their prospective new employees high tip income. And in fact, when doing research for this video, I found that employees of the restaurant business actually prefer to be paid in tips. They see it as a reward for working hard and gives them incentive to perform during peak business hours. If they were paid an hourly wage, then they would have no financial incentive to hustle during rush hours for their guests. Now, of course, you could argue that they would be fired for poor performance under standard payment conditions, but remember, the labor market is strongly in favor of the employee right now. Fire one employee and you may have a hard time getting a new one to fill their space. Employers may not be willing to take that risk in this labor market. There was a recent article about a Denver restaurant offering their employees $30 an hour with no tipping to be allowed, and many service workers were upset about that. They felt that they would make more money under the tipping economic model. Getting back to the promise of high tip income, how would an employer be able to support such a claim? After all, tipping can be highly dependent on several factors: the guests at the restaurant on a given night, the day of the week, the weather, special events or holidays, the time of year, among others. Well, this is where behavioral economics come into play with the help of technology. If you are enjoying this video, then you can leave me a tip by hitting that like button, and consider subscribing to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one in the future. So beyond the macroeconomics, there are two main factors at play on how we've seen tipping balloon out of control. Imagine you enter a restaurant where you go up to the counter and place your order. The worker inputs your choices and tells you the cost of your order. You pull out your credit card and hand it over to the cashier. They insert the card into the machine, and after the transaction is approved, the white touch screen is spun in your direction. You are then prompted to select your tip amount. At this moment, you might be feeling two societal pressures. First, the cashier, who is the direct beneficiary of your choice to tip or not, is standing right in front of you, watching you. In this instance, many people feel the pressure not to be a cheapskate. This is an odd American societal pressure that we have created through our own economic systemic choices. Traditionally, we know that restaurants are able to offer substandard wages to their employees, and tips are supposed to make up a portion of their income. The perception then becomes, if you as a person do not support them, then you are causing financial harm to that person, at least as society has led you to believe. To be clear, I am not insinuating anything about you, the viewer's personal choice to tip or not. You are not directly harming a person by not tipping. I am merely explaining the societal pressures that have been established here in the United States. They can make you feel that way about your decision to tip or not. You should not feel bad for spending your money how you choose. Additionally, with so many restaurants and services now asking for tips at their registers, it's hard for the customer to actually know if the worker behind the counter is being paid a standard hourly wage, like at a McDonald's, or not. This can create an odd, in-the-moment dynamic guessing game, and in most cases, I know I personally err on the side of them needing the tip income as a part of their wages, and so I include the tip in the bill. Secondly, when it comes to societal pressures, there are some instances where there's a line of customers behind you also waiting to place their own orders. Some people can feel rushed to expedite their own personal transaction so as not to be a bottleneck at a restaurant. And what is the quickest way to expedite your transaction? Select a standard tip amount and move on with your day. To understand the bottleneck point a bit further, we need to look at the technological factors at play and how they nudge the customer. In the last decade, we have seen the rise of these modern point-of-sale systems that companies like Square or Toast offer to these small retailers. I'm sure you are all familiar with the famous tablet spin, as the screen is turned towards you, prompting you to select your desired tip amount. These screens are well crafted with the intention to get you to tip, and tip a higher amount than you might otherwise do. First, take a look out at the layout of the screen. Americans read left to right and top to bottom. In this case, the first row are the default tip amounts. Notice how these tip percentages have become inflated. Traditionally, a tip of 10 to 20% was considered a good tip amount, with most people offering 15% as the standard. Now we see 15% is the low range and 25% as a default option. In their seminal work, Nudge, Richard Thaler, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, and Cass Sunstein call this anchoring. In their book, they talk about taxi cabs that began to take tips electronically and have noticed a nice increase in tips because more people pay with cards than cash these days. Taxis were reluctant to let the credit card companies take their 3% cut, but the end result has been better for cabs because they can set their tip percentage anchors to a higher level electronically, and most people will select one of those default options. Now, if you set the anchors too high, then you risk provoking the customer. They can become off-put by the higher aggressive defaults. Thaler and Sunstein call this reactance. When people are ordered around, they might get mad and do the opposite of what you're trying to get them to do in the first place. Ultimately, though, they note in their example that the taxi cab saw a greater increase in tip revenue even with higher rates of reactance. Getting back to the higher defaults, adding a 25% markup on top of your dinner menu is kind of crazy, especially if we're talking about counter service. I could see it for a bartender making fancy cocktails or at a sit-down restaurant that is offering exceptional service, but this really feels like it has started to get out of hand. One last thing to note about the default options is the sneaky decision to calculate the tip with tax included. In America, it is generally accepted that you don't have to tip on the post-tax amount. Many people do, and I certainly usually do out of simplicity. There's that friction barrier again, but normally it's not required. But by giving you a pre-calculated amount with the tax included, they are removing that decision for you and rewarding the worker with a higher tip wage. Getting back to the screen, we see that the buttons on the top row are large and quick to digest. Most people will probably hit the middle button. Naturally, the center of the screen is where we tend to focus. So setting that at 20% is already a mark above that 15% standard that I mentioned a bit ago. Going beyond the first line induces what I'm calling decision friction. There are two options here. First, you can set a custom tip amount, and this requires extra steps. You have to calculate and manually enter in the amount you want to tip. That induces 2 layers of friction on the shopper. Second, you can choose not to tip at all. This bears the friction of that societal pressures we have already talked about, something that most people seem to be reluctant to do. So if you have made it this far into the transaction decision tree, you are likely to return to one of those quick options to end the transaction without incurring any weird imaginary social shame. So how do these nudges benefit businesses? By setting the tip percentages higher, these businesses can attract workers to work at their businesses by promising them higher default tip percentages. This allows the business to stay competitive in the labor market and keep their menu costs down by passing the costs of paying their workers on to you, the customer. Secondly, companies like Toast and Square are all too eager to design these technological nudges into their systems. While the company can ultimately set their own default tip percentages on the POS system, I am sure that these companies are willing to provide insight on which percentages might be best for the retailer. After all, Toast and Square are getting a % cut of that tip revenue that's coming in, so they are incentivized to make sure that their retailers are maximizing the tip revenue they gain from their customers. So with all of that information, have we reached a tipping point? I think that people are starting to get tipping fatigue. We have seen recent studies start to support that claim, and I've certainly seen more discussion about tipping in the news and on social media. It's what prompted me to do this video in the first place. I don't want this to come off as hostile towards workers. Working in the restaurant industry can be busy, stressful, and hectic, and if they are working hard, then they should be rewarded for that. On some levels, I do wish that the US would get rid of the substandard wages and tipping scheme. This would create a lot more transparency for customers on costs, which I think is a good thing. But we could spend a whole separate video talking about how that would fundamentally change the restaurant industry in the US and what impacts it would have. According to the Bankrate survey, 41% of Americans also wish that businesses would pay their employees better rather than relying so much on tips. But in the same survey, only 16% said they would be willing to pay higher prices if they could do away with tipping, which, is a pretty big discrepancy and why the system is here to stay for now. So let me know what you think in the comments. Have you become tired of the tip inflation? Have you cut back on restaurants or tipping? No judgment on my end. I'm just curious to see what decisions people are making. If you enjoyed this video, please consider checking out the one on the screen now. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.